Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Singh, on the heels of the NATO summit, let me start by complimenting your boss. I thought that Secretary Pompeo's comments about the importance of the alliance, calling it perhaps the most successful and important military alliance in the history of the world, was appropriate, and I appreciated his speaking out on that. With regard to the issue we have before us today, I think you've heard clearly from some of my colleagues already on the broader issue of concern about what will happen with both increased tariffs and higher costs to our consumers and our companies, but also the impact on our exporters. Let me say that I think in response to your questions, respectfully, you should also talk about the vision the President laid out at the G7 summit in June, which was no tariffs. And maybe I was just listening for what I wanted to hear, but what I heard was that there is an ultimate vision here of getting us to a world where both tariff and non-tariff barriers are reduced substantially or even eliminated to the benefit of the economies of countries around the world, including ours. And I hope that's the ultimate objective here, is to have the United States continue to play the leading role as the country that advocates more open markets, more transparency, less corruption. That's been our historic role over the decades. My concern is, and this is from talking not just to our negotiators, but also to people from some of these other countries, including China and including the EU and Canada, that we have not laid out clear, realistic objectives as we take on these countries with regard to China, the 301, the 25% tariffs on the 36 billion, another, or 34 billion, another 16 billion coming at 25%, another 200 billion at 10%. And so the Chinese are confused. They're not sure if it is because we want to see them buy more of our products, which was an objective, I think, which was raised with them, specifically with regard to soybeans and LNG, liquefied natural gas. They're not sure if it is the structural changes that you talk about in your testimony, including, as you say, stopping their discrimination against international competition, technology transfer, theft of sensitive intellectual property. They're not sure if it's about steel overcapacity, which for me is a huge issue. Ultimately, what we see around the world is partly a response to China now producing half of the world's steel when they produced probably 15% of it 15 years ago, and therefore having that steel come through transshipment to our country. They don't know. I think the same is true with the European Union. Recently there's been discussion with regard to the 232 case, again different than the 301, that it's about autos. Well, if it's about autos, we ought to be very clear. And I don't think that 232 is the right tool to use, but to the extent we have these tariffs in place, we need to be clear and, again, realistic in terms of our objectives. Senator Isaacson talked about my being in this position to negotiate in the past, and I think it's clear to all people who have been in that position that without having a clear and realistic negotiating objective, and as compared to that, sending mixed messages, it's very difficult to get to a solution. So I say this to you as the representative of the administration who's here, knowing you're not in direct negotiations, but maybe you could respond to that. Do our trading partners know what our objectives are with regard to these trade cases that we've initiated?
Well, thank you so much, Senator. When it comes to the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, we are having many bilateral conversations. As you may know, there are some countries with whom we've come to agreement on quotas. There are other countries where we had a conversation and we were not able to come to agreement. So we are talking to countries very individually and helping them understand what we would like to see achieved.
Yeah, and that's an interesting response because it is true with regard to some countries. We have been able to negotiate something. With regard to others, some of our strongest allies, including Canada, Mexico, and the EU, we have not. And again, I'm not sure they know. With Canada, we've talked about their dairy program. By the way, that doesn't fit within the national security criteria, but if that's it, we should be clear. With regard to the EU, you know, we've talked about the auto issue. With regard to Mexico, we've talked about potatoes being able to be sold in the interior or state-owned enterprises, but I'm not sure that they, from what I'm hearing from them, that they understand what the objective is. NAFTA, of course, is the broader issue, but again, not a 232 issue. Mr. Chairman, I see my time is expiring. I would just like to submit for the record some thoughts about 232. I believe that the entity that is best capable of determining what's in our national security interest is the Department of Defense. And I believe the statute could be changed to do that. I believe that there ought to be a tightening of the criteria so we understand what national security is using the CFIUS and Joint Chiefs definition. I believe that the disapproval, which is already in the legislation, could be broadened to all products, not just oil. I think there are things we could do to ensure that going forward that we don't misuse 232, because my concern is we will lose the tool. We will lose it because one of two things will happen. Either other countries will respond in kind, as we're starting to see, without showing injury, without showing any unfair trade, or we'll go back to the WTO as we have been in the past, and this time we will find ourselves losing an Article 21 case with regard to 232 because of the way we've used it so broadly. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence, and appreciate your testimony today, Ms. Singh.